welcome to the Festival of Storytellers.
I can't tell you how excited I am to be on right now. It's been a couple of weeks of excitement, getting prepared, and I've done a lot of things in my life, but this has got to be close to the top.
Thank you, Reader's Magnet, and thank you, John, for putting this forth and taking the chance on us authors in presenting this out to the world.
I've enjoyed this immensely, Joanne.
Ellie, so have I. Thank you for who you are, and thank you, Reader's Magnet. You all are beautiful, and you've worked so very hard, and we are blessed.
We are.
I thank everybody that's involved with this process, because we know writers need readers and writers need publishers. We thank Reader's Magnet and everybody that's involved. I love Reader's Magnet. They say, we share your stories with the world.
Hello, everybody out there. I'm not sure where you are, who you are in the world, but I am in Florida, and maybe from my accent, you can tell that I grew up in England, and I went to Canada, and now I'm in the United States. And as I retired, I had time to write. And I'm going to talk about my writing process and about my book here. My book is called Ripple Effect Because of the War being the Second World War in England. And because I grew up in England, I have lots of knowledge about the effects of war on people. And that the story is about the effect of war on a family. So let me tell you about how my writing process started. I joined a little writing group in Victoria, Canada, many years ago, and started my hand at writing personal subjects, sort of like a memoir. And then I thought, okay, well, maybe I'll make a book out of this. I really like writing. People seem to like what I was doing. So I thought, okay, I will write a memoir because I have many stories to tell. I've led a rich and varied life, met lots of interesting people. So I started to write this as a memoir. And as I was going along, I realized, as I was talking about my family and the family history and some of the stories that my parents told me and some of the knowledge I had about our family, I decided that I might actually upset a few people in my family, some people who were still alive. So, the skeletons were beginning to rattle in the closet, some of the secrets and lies that were going on in my family. So I decided, okay, the best thing to do here is to write a novel. And then I can be free to write about whatever I wanted using aspects of my family's life, aspects of the secrets, and turn the people into fictional people. And in this way, I had more fun. I could create more drama. I could have certain characters develop in certain ways and fall down, stand up, grow. So I actually had fun turning it into a novel. Now, it's a historical fiction, so therefore I had to make sure that my historical facts were correct. So I did a lot of research, and I had a spreadsheet that listed the times and dates of various events that were happening before, during, and after the Second World War in England. Because if I'm writing a historical novel, if the background of my family is actually set in real historical times, I needed to get those facts right. And as I started the novel, the beginning part was in a time before I was born, before the Second World War, and during the war. I was not around during the war. I grew up after the war. So because my novel started before the war, I had to do a lot of research. So that was the background. So, for example, if you were to make a movie of this, you would have to make sure that the costumes were of that era, that the facts were right, that the places were correct. So that's what I did. I had the spreadsheet and I found out, what people were wearing, where the bombs dropped in London, where people were living, what their life was like, everyday life, not in the actual bombing or actual war, but what their everyday life was in the country and how everyday life was for normal people who were not actually, the soldiers. So really my story is about a regular family, if there ever is such a thing as a regular family, but anyway, not actual war stories of people actually, in the war being bombed and fighting. It's not a battle sort of scenario. It's about what happened in everyday life for people in England. So I'm not sure what the audience is for readers for this little webinar here or live streaming. I'm not sure whether it's United States or beyond, if it goes to England or other English-speaking countries. But because this is set in England and it is set in a particular time, I wrote using English spelling. So if any of you are writers, you get a spell check. And it says, no, that's not how you spell it. I got somebody said, Amanda, hello, Jenny. Nice to see you again today. Oh, you've heard me before, Amanda. Okay. Maybe I have something different for you to hear, or you can ask me some questions. Thank you, Amanda. So as a writer, you use various, software to write your book. And that is very useful. Not only just the spelling, but also the grammar. So I used AutoCrit, which is a software that you put your manuscript in and tells you all the things that all the words you've repeated, all the incorrect grammar, and gives you some suggestions how to fix it. I usually use Grammarly as well. Actually, I use Grammarly on everything in my computer to make sure that I spell everything right. So as I was going along, as a writer, for any writers out there, it's a very lonely and private process. And whenever you've written something, you think, of course, you're totally brilliant and everything is wonderful because of the great feeling that you have about actually putting something on paper or, in this case, on computer. And then I joined a critique group. And it's very important to have people to look at your work and critique it and tell you whether that character is believable and whether your grammar is correct. And I've joined a critique group here in the villages where I live. A lot of critique groups here. And I joined one which was really invaluable. When I first started, I got back all these comments, just like in high school. You get back all these red marks. Okay, that doesn't make sense. Go back and rewrite it again. Well, I had a lot of those when I first started, and I thought, oh my gosh, I'm not as good a writer as I thought. But in the process of that, I was able to tidy up my document, so they were live editors, as it were, and that was very, very important to get feedback from people, so that you get a sense of whether your writing works or whether your story is working. And then when I had finished my manuscript, which of course took actually several years, when I finished my manuscript, then I found somebody who didn't know me, who would make comments and not worry about hurting my feelings. So I found somebody who would give me content editing, who look at the whole manuscript from beginning to end to see whether the arcs are work for each character. If you're not sure what an arc means, it's how the character starts off and how they change throughout the story, whether they change for the better, for the worse, or basically change because of the story that you're telling. So there's a whole arc to individuals within the story, and a whole arc for the whole book, a beginning, a middle, and an end. And hopefully, as one reads it, and you feel like you've been through a process and you understand people in a different way. So so I had a content editor, and then I had somebody to check the spelling and the punctuation and all that sort of thing. And then the manuscript was ready. So I'm really talking about the process if people are interested in this. So once I had the manuscript ready, as far as I thought it would be, somebody said, well, why don't you enter it into a competition and see what it's like? You haven't got a publisher. This is just a raw manuscript, and just enter it in a competition as an unpublished book and see what happens. So down here in Florida, there's a writers' conference every year in October, and they have a competition called the Royal Palm Literary Competition. And there are various genres that are there. So you only compete with the similar genres. So mine was historical fiction, women's fiction, and literary fiction. So I entered that in a sort of a blended genre, because I couldn't decide if it was one thing or other. It certainly was historical fiction, but it applies. A lot of women would find it interesting. So I entered it in that competition a few years ago. And the purpose of that really was not to see whether I'd win anything, but to get what's called the rubrics, which is the unbiased critique of your book. And that's what I put it in for. So I went along to the conference, and surprise, surprise, I actually won a prize. I won first prize for historical fiction and blended fiction, women's fiction, and first prize in my genre here. So I got a little sticker up here. It says first prize for the Royal Palm Literary Competition. So then I decided, well, that's not basically a book is fairly good then. Some people like it. And I got the critiques back, and I went and changed a few things and made it a little bit better. Then I entered it into the Reader's Favorites competition, and I got 5 stars, and I got a silver award. I got these little stickers on there. So I'm pretty proud of that. So I figured that, okay, my book's probably pretty good. Keith Lee says, wow, your book deserved that award. Well, I hope you've read it, Keith. Well, you can't tell a book by the cover. I mean, it's got lots of awards on it, but you have to actually open the thing and read it, and read the blurb on the back and decide whether that's something that would interest you. Now, I'm sure a lot of my people here are in the United States. So you might think, well, why do I want to read an English book, especially with English spelling? But you might find it curious. You might learn about everyday life in England. Oh, Amanda Kane says, I'd like to know more about PTSD. Anything might be relevant info about that. All right, so let me just go to the PTSD thing. So one of my characters here, the main male character, started off before the war being a normal, happy, romantic man, linking up with a woman, and they got married and everything seemed normal and happy. Then he went to war. And as many people who go to war, they encounter all kinds of horrors and are traumatized by what they've seen or what they have contributed to about. It's all to do with the trauma of life and death. And post-traumatic stress disorder comes from that, how that wires your brain and your nervous system in a different way. It becomes hot-wired, if you like. So post-traumatic stress disorder is very common from anybody who's been in any conflict. And it happened in the Second World War, happened in the First World War, it happened with all the veterans returning from Afghanistan, and any war that anybody's been in. Pretty much everybody who's been in active service is going to come back with some kind of trauma, and that is called post-traumatic stress disorder now. Back in these times, back in the Second World War, it was called battle fatigue. And there was a lot of judgment about that, saying that people were weak and what's the matter with you? What's wrong with you? And they would be sent back into the front line and very often would not survive. Now, these days, people return from war with post-traumatic stress disorder, and they try and deal with that, try and do the stiff upper lip thing and try and pretend nothing's wrong, but there's going to be angry outbursts because the nervous system's deregulated. There's going to be nightmares because of you reliving the traumas. And very often people will turn to alcohol or drugs of various kinds. And of course, the drugs are available now. And very often people come back with addictions apart from just the trauma in their brain. And what really needs to happen is for people to admit that they have a problem. And for a lot of men, that's hard to admit that. And a lot of the soldiers, of course, were men back in the past, not so much now. Women join the military now. It is first about admitting that you have an issue. And very often that will only come when people hit bottom or when things get really bad. Before that, they may not want to admit it to anybody or even to themselves. When things get really bad, then it's like, okay, I need to really do something. When things get really bad is when addiction becomes overwhelming, takes over your life, or when there's potential for suicide, thinking about suicide, depression, anger. And very often there's violence and family violence, and how it affects a family can be quite traumatic in itself. In this book, we have a man who starts off being happy, normal, likable, functioning man, and as he returns from war, he comes back with PTSD, and the family almost falls apart, and he almost commits suicide. So that's the downside of his story. And I have the story of his wife and how she deals with that and how that becomes traumatic. So he did go in the book. I do have him going to counseling and going to AA. So both of those are really good ways in which to begin to deal with it. First thing is to start talking. Battle fatigue. This is a new term. You didn't know that? Okay. Battle fatigue. That's what they used back in the Second World War. Yeah. And the First World War. They thought there was something wrong with you if you were scared and you were nervous. Something wrong with you. But just that you're just worn out and hurt from it. So now we have a name for it. It's post-traumatic stress disorder. I'm not sure exactly when that was clinically became an issue, but yes, it can be treated. In my previous life, I was a psychologist, and I did help people with post-traumatic stress disorder. There's various ways to deal with that, to change the nervous system, to calm it down. There's various ways to actually change the memories so they're not as vivid, so it doesn't feel like it's happening right now. That's what very often people wake up and have nightmares. They think it's happening again. They hear loud noises and they think they're being shot at again. So it's about changing the memories inside, and you can do that. So it's just like looking at a movie, not like you're in it. So that's some of the therapies that can be done. Oh, Keith Lee says, I'm learning new terms from you, Jenny. Well, thanks, Keith Lee. There are, in this book, when they're only just beginning to deal with how to treat battle fatigue at that time, I have the man go to a residential treatment center where he joined a therapy group to deal with, to start talking and to begin to deal with the memories. And in that book, way back then, they did use hypnosis. That was beginning of some of the treatment. And that in the book, that began to help him, and he began to get some of the heat out of his brain and begin to have some hope. And so he was able to then go back and reconnect with his family and begin to change the downward spiral. Now, these days, hypnosis is possible. There's something called self-regulation therapy, and there's something called EMDR, and of course, there's medication and straight talk. But I'm a big proponent of doing something that changes the wiring inside. So that's what I did. But in this story, it's not all doom and gloom. I have okay. So there is the theme of post-traumatic stress disorder and healing from that. There is the theme of addiction and healing from that. There's the theme of how that affects a family and some family violence, and how that affects the children and the wife at home. I also have a story of a little girl who lost her mother during the war, and she was evacuated from London. Now, so the government in those days was pretty wise to try and protect the mothers and children from the severe bombing that London was about to undergo. They knew it would probably be pretty devastating. So the London Blitz that actually did happen was very devastating. A lot of London was destroyed, just like it's happening in Ukraine now. The targets were the industrial places, the munitions, the places where all the warships were. So London was very, very badly destroyed by what's called the London Blitz. So the government, before this, they knew it was happening, likely to happen. So they ordered women and children to leave London. They were evacuated, and they were en masse. They left London, and only essential people stayed in London to carry on the city and to carry on what was going on. These children and mothers were evacuated to the countryside, to safe places outside the industrial cities. So I follow a little girl who was evacuated, and she went to live with her aunt in the countryside and grew up a happy, free little girl, fishing, riding bikes, fairly normal life, except she was living with her aunt, and there was no man there because her husband had gone to war, so it was just the two women. So it follows her life and how she grew up as a fairly normal teenager, and how she dealt with her, well, she was adopted eventually by her aunt in the story, and how she dealt with the returning man who was not her father but became her adopted father, and how she dealt with his PTSD. So you've got her growing up, attempting to be a normal child with boyfriends and all that, the ins and outs of growing up as a teenager. So that's fairly normal, which I related to that because I grew up as a fairly normal teenager in England. So a lot of my everyday experiences are attached to her. Now, what was interesting for her in the story was following the theme is of adoption, because she was adopted by her aunt, and towards the end of the story, she finds out she's not adopted. That she is adopted. She didn't know she was adopted, and she didn't know she had a biological mother. So I've got the theme of adoption in here. Now, her biological mother does show up at the end and surprises everybody because everybody thought she was dead, that she'd been killed in the Blitz. So here it's about how people deal with a biological mother, a biological parent showing up. Because in many years past, adoption details were sealed, and children didn't know who their mother was, and the mother didn't know where her child was, because in many cases, unwed mothers were made to give up their children. It wasn't acceptable for single mothers to raise their children. Of course, that's changed now, but way back then it was not acceptable, and single mothers gave up their children, and really suffered from that loss, that big hole in their heart, just as the children suffered from a hole in their heart if they knew that they were adopted. But in this case, we've got some trauma around the adoption process. So I have the theme of adoption. I have the theme of post-traumatic stress disorder. I also have a theme of independent women. So during the Second World War, when men went to war, the women went to work. So we have city women, women who are housewives, who went out to work in the fields to milk cows, muck out the pigs, feed the chickens, drive tractors. City women who had to go out and become what they call land girls, work on the land. And we had also housewives who went to work in the factories, making munitions, making guns, making bullets, and all of that sort of stuff. And we had women driving ambulances, picking up dead bodies. So the women became very independent and strong women, and with minds of their own. There were no men around to boss them around, or they did not have men in the house. And in some cases, there were wartime romances. Keith Lee says, Ripple Effect did cover a lot of helpful topics for everyone. Well, hopefully there are interesting. You learn something from it, and I learned something about the time and how that affects people. And goodness, I just feel for the people in Ukraine and what that's like. So many people evacuated, left, some people stayed, and goodness knows how that's going to end up. But there's going to be a lot of trauma and dislocated families because of that. I have 4 minutes left, I've been told. All right. So if anybody wishes to read my book and follow a family through all the ups and downs, please go to amazon.com. I'm sure everybody knows that. And write in Ripple Effect because of the war. There are other Ripple Effect books. And you can get a hard copy, a soft copy, and an ebook, and also an audiobook. Because I have an English accent, I'm kind of like acting a little bit. I read my book and put on the various voices for various people in there. So I made an audiobook, and I think that's actually free right now. If anybody purchased my book, please leave a review. Give me a few stars. Any star is fine. Just leave a little blurb, say you liked it, you didn't like it, or you found it interesting, or whatever. Reviews are very good. So I really appreciate you listening to me, whether you're readers or writers. Just enjoy what you're doing. Enjoy the read, enjoy the write. And I will be back later. Have a great day.